I climbed the internal ladder at 7:43 a.m. on what I still thought of as a normal Tuesday. My boots rang against the steel rungs in the rhythm I developed over 3 years of working bridge maintenance. Steady, unhurried, the kind of pace that got you to the top of a 200-foot tower without arriving breathless. The maintenance room waited at the same height it had always waited, a small climate-controlled box bolted to the tower's southern face, overlooking the river and both approach roads. I unlocked the door with a key I kept separate from my truck keys and stepped into the familiar smell of metal, electrical components, and the faint plasticky odor of the chemical toilet in the corner. Everything sat exactly where I'd left it Friday afternoon. The cable tension monitors displaying their constant readouts, the rust inspection logs in their 3-ring binder on a small desk, the safety equipment hanging on pegs along the eastern wall. I performed this same inspection maybe 300 times, and the routine had worn smooth grooves into my thinking. The first thing I always did was check the monitors. The bridge's suspension cables generated data constantly, measuring strain and temperature and a dozen other variables that told the story of how the structure was handling its load. That morning, the numbers looked normal except for one hydraulic dampener showing irregular pressure readings. Nothing critical, but enough to require notation in the log. I wrote down the values with the mechanical pencil I kept clipped to the binder, dated the entry, and initialed it. The windows faced both directions along the bridge's length. To the north, the approach road curved down toward the city, 6 lanes of morning traffic moving at the usual pace. To the south, the road descended toward the suburbs and the industrial parks where I'd grown up. Below, maybe 180 feet down, the river moved with the tide, dark green and steady. 2 ferries were making their crossing routes, white wakes spreading behind them. I pulled out my radio and keyed the mic bridge maintenance, South Tower check-in. Systems normal, minor notation on dampener 7. The dispatcher's voice came back after a moment. Copy that, South Tower. Note logged. Something about her tone made me pause. She sounded strained, like she was reading from a script while thinking about something else entirely. I'd worked with dispatch for 3 years and knew most of their voices, but couldn't place which operator this was. Everything okay down there? I asked. Static filled the pause before she responded. Traffic incident on the north approach. Emergency services en route. Maintain your position and continue standard procedures. Copy, I said, and clipped the radio back to my belt. Traffic incidents happen weekly on a bridge this size. Fender benders, stalled vehicles, the occasional drunk driver during morning rush hour. The phrasing bothered me slightly. Traffic incident instead of accident, but not enough to interrupt my routine. I had a dampener to inspect, rust spots to photograph, and a safety equipment inventory to complete before lunch. I opened the equipment locker and started counting harnesses. Outside the window, the morning sun caught the bridge's cables at an angle that made them gleam like drawn wire. The traffic below continued moving, steady as a pulse. I logged each harness in the inventory sheet, checking expiration dates on the nylon webbing, and tried to ignore the feeling that the dispatcher's strained voice had planted in my thoughts. The weather was clear. The bridge was handling its load. The maintenance room sat solid and secure around me, doing what it had been designed to do since 1987. Everything was exactly as it should have been. I finished the inventory at 8:15 and decided to photograph the dampener housing before climbing down to my truck for the replacement filters I'd forgotten that morning. The journal sat open on the desk, my handwriting filling another page of technical observations that would probably never be read by anyone except the next bridge inspector. I wrote the time, the date, the weather conditions, and the current status of all systems. Normal. Everything normal. I should have paid more attention to that strained voice on the radio. I descended the tower ladder around 10 a.m., moving with the same steady rhythm, boots finding rungs by muscle memory. My truck sat in its usual spot at the tower's base, a white Ford with the municipal logo on the door and 3 years of bridge grime coating the wheel wells. I'd parked there every working day since taking this job, always in the same space, always with the nose pointed toward the service road exit. The radio was on. I always left it on, tuned to the emergency services frequency. Not because I was supposed to monitor it, but because bridge maintenance existed in the overlap between public works and emergency response. We heard about accidents before dispatch called us, learned about weather emergencies while they were still developing, got advance warning when the bridge needed to close. It was useful information delivered in the background static of my workday. But that morning, the radio was speaking in a different language. Multiple voices overlapped, units calling for backup at locations spread across the entire city. I stood with the truck door open, one hand on the replacement filters I'd come to retrieve, and listened to the rhythm of emergency response falling apart in real time. Unit 47 requesting immediate backup. Intersection of Maple and 5th. We have multiple subjects not responding to commands. Dispatch. This is Engine 12. We need police support at the medical center. Crowd control situation becoming officer down, need medical at. The voices cut across each other, some calm and professional, others with edges of panic that didn't belong on emergency channels. I'd heard accident response before, had monitored bad days when multi-car pileups or structure fires strained the system. This sounded different. The calls weren't coordinating, they were fragmenting. I pulled out my phone and found 3 text messages from my supervisor, all sent in the last 20 minutes. Stay on site until further notice. Do not leave bridge property. Confirm receipt. I typed back, confirmed. What's happening? The message sat with the sending indicator spinning for 30 seconds before failing. I tried again. Same result. Check my signal, full bars, but the network was clearly overloaded. From where I stood at the tower base, I could see maybe half a mile of the northern approach. Traffic had slowed to a crawl, cars packed tighter than normal rush hour. Smoke rose from 3 different points in the city. Thick columns, black, the kind that came from buildings or vehicles burning. Not chimney smoke, not control burns. The radio continued its fragmented reporting. Multiple subjects not responding, need backup, officer down. I grabbed the filters, slammed the truck door, and started climbing back up the tower ladder. The decision felt automatic. Some instinct said that height was safety, that the maintenance room was more secure than ground level. I didn't consciously think it through. I just climbed. Halfway up, I stopped and descended again. Went back to the truck, pulled out the case of water bottles I kept for long inspection days, 12 bottles, still sealed. Grabbed the emergency blanket from behind the seat, the first aid kit from the glove box, the half-empty bag of trail mix I'd been snacking on all week. The radio was still fragmenting. Dispatch, we've lost contact with Unit 23. I turned it off, carried everything to the ladder, and made 3 trips to haul it all up to the maintenance room. My hand was shaking slightly by the 3rd climb. I didn't understand why. Traffic accidents and building fires didn't explain the supervisor's messages or the panic in those radio voices or my own instinct to retreat to height. Back in the maintenance room, I stacked the water bottles against the wall and stood at the window facing north. The traffic had stopped completely now, turned into a parking lot of motionless vehicles stretching back toward the city. People were getting out of their cars. From 200 feet up, they looked like small figures moving between the larger shapes of sedans and trucks, some walking toward the bridge deck, others standing beside their vehicles. I pulled the binoculars from their hook, industrial grade, the kind I use for inspecting cable connections at distance, and focused on the nearest cluster of cars. A woman in a blue sedan was honking her horn, the movement visible even if I couldn't hear the sound. 3 people approached her driver's side window. Their movements looked wrong. Not hurried, but not casual either. Jerking, uncoordinated, like marionettes operated by someone still learning the strings. She stopped honking, tried to reverse, hit the car behind her with enough force that I could see both vehicles rock from the impact. She got out screaming, mouth open, body language pure panic, and ran toward the pedestrian walkway. The 3 people followed. So did others who'd been standing near other vehicles, all moving with that same wrong motion, converging on her running figure with singular purpose. I lowered the binoculars. My chest felt tight. The maintenance room suddenly seemed very small and very far from everything I understood about the world. The radio on my belt crackled, nothing but static and occasional bursts of shouting, words too distorted to understand. I walked to the door, checked that it was locked from the inside, and stood there with my hand on the deadbolt for a long time, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. By noon, the gridlock had transformed into something else entirely. The bridge approaches weren't just stopped, they'd become abandoned. Hundreds of cars sat empty, doors hanging open, personal belongings scattered across the pavement. From my windows, the scene looked like a photograph of evacuation, except the people hadn't evacuated. They just changed. I watched through the binoculars for over an hour, methodically scanning from one end of my visible range to the other, trying to catalog what I was seeing in terms that made sense. My brain kept offering rational explanations. Chemical spill, everyone fled on foot. Gas leak, mass evacuation. Terrorist attack, panic response. But none of those explanations fit the specifics of what the binoculars showed me. The people who'd left their cars weren't fleeing. They were wandering, moving slowly between vehicles, some limping, others walking in circles or standing motionless for long periods before resuming movement. Their coordination was wrong. I kept coming back to that observation. They moved like people who'd forgotten how bodies worked, relearning the basic mechanics of walking with each step. A man in a business suit stood beside a pickup truck for 15 minutes without moving. Then he turned, very slowly, and walked directly into the truck's side mirror with enough force to snap his head back. He didn't react to the impact, just adjusted his direction slightly and continued walking, now with blood running down his face from where the mirror had split his forehead. A woman in a blue sedan, not the same one I'd seen earlier, tried to navigate through the gridlock by driving on the shoulder. She made it maybe 50 feet before people began converging on her vehicle. Not running, but walking with that terrible purpose surrounding the car from all sides. She accelerated, hit two of them, kept going. They didn't try to dodge, just took the impacts and fell. She reached a clear section of road and sped toward the bridge deck. I lost sight of her behind the tower structure, but heard, or maybe felt, a crash somewhere on the far side. Metal on metal, loud enough to transmit through the bridge's structure as vibration. More people were appearing on the bridge deck itself now, coming from both directions. Some walked normally, looking over their shoulders, moving fast. Others had that jerking, wrong motion. I watched one of the normal ones, a young man in a reflective vest, maybe a construction worker, sprint past three of the wrong ones. They turned to follow him, but couldn't match his speed. He disappeared into the gridlock on the southern approach. 2 minutes later, he came back at a walk. Same reflective vest. Same person. Different movement. The wrongness had transferred to him like a virus jumping hosts. That was when I started using the word infected in my head. Not as a medical term. I had no idea what I was witnessing in medical terms, but as a categorical label. There were normal people and infected people, and the infection changed how they moved, how they behaved, what they wanted. What they wanted seemed to be other people. I watched an infected woman corner a normal man against a concrete barrier. He fought. I saw his arms moving, his body twisting, but she was stronger or he was weaker or the infection gave some advantage I couldn't identify from this distance. When it was over, he lay motionless on the pavement and she crouched over him for a long time. When she stood up again, her mouth and hands were dark with something I didn't let myself think about too carefully. The radio on my belt had gone almost completely silent. Occasional bursts of static, fragments of words, then nothing for long stretches. I tried the emergency broadcast frequency, the municipal operations channel, even the weather radio. Static on all of them, or automated warnings telling me to shelter in place, stay indoors, avoid contact with affected individuals. Affected, that was the official term. I preferred infected. I tried my phone again. Still no data, no calls going through. One text managed to send to my wife. Stay inside. Locked doors. I'm safe on bridge. I never got confirmation it delivered. Never got a response. The afternoon light changed the quality of what I could see through the binoculars. Shadows lengthened, making it harder to distinguish details. Easier to imagine I was misinterpreting normal behavior. But I wasn't. A man dragged himself across the pavement, using only his arms, both legs useless but still trying to reach a woman hiding between cars. A cluster of infected stood in a circle around something I didn't look at too closely, their heads lowering and raising in a rhythm that made my stomach turn. A police car tried to force its way through the gridlock on the northern approach, using its push bumper to shove vehicles aside. It made decent progress until a crowd surrounded it. 30 or 40 infected moving with that terrible coordinated purpose. The officers got out, fired their weapons. I saw muzzle flashes, saw infected fall, saw more infected keep coming. The officers disappeared into the crowd. Their car sat empty, doors open, lights still flashing red and blue against the gathering dusk. I backed away from the window and sat on the floor with my back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. The maintenance room's fluorescent lights hummed their constant electrical song. The cable tension monitors beeped softly, displaying numbers that no longer mattered. The world outside had become something unrecognizable, but the bridge continued performing its structural calculations as if nothing had changed. I pulled out the maintenance journal and logged the date, the time, and a single sentence: systemic collapse of social order. Unknown cause. Remain in position. My handwriting looked steady on the page. That surprised me. I'd expected it to shake. I started with inventory, because inventory was concrete, countable, something I could control. The maintenance room had been stocked for extended weather inspections, situations where bridge workers might need to stay in the tower during storms or overnight repairs. I never actually used most of the emergency supplies, had just noted their existence during my normal routines, confirming they were present and properly stored. Now I pulled everything out and arranged it on the floor. Tools first. Standard bridge maintenance equipment, socket sets, torque wrenches, cable inspection gear, welding supplies, electrical testing equipment. Useful for repairs, less useful for survival. Safety equipment. 6 harnesses with current inspection dates, 50 feet of rated climbing rope. For carabiners, 2 hard hats, work gloves, safety glasses, reflective vests. I was already wearing most of what I needed. First aid kit, comprehensive, designed for industrial accidents. Bandages, antiseptic, burn cream, splints, emergency blanket, instruction manual. Expiration date, 2023. Close enough. Food. This was the concerning part. Emergency rations in vacuum-sealed packages, dated 2019. 6 packages total, each containing 2,400 calories of dense, unappetizing nutrition. Some granola bars in a bin, also expired. A box of instant coffee packets. 3 cans of soup I'd brought up months ago and forgotten about. I did the math. Maybe 18,000 calories total, 2,000 calories per day if I was careful, 9 days of food if nothing else changed. Water, 6-gallon jug stored under the desk. 3 more I'd brought up for the truck that morning. 9 gallons total. A gallon per day for drinking and basic hygiene meant 9 days again. The numbers kept circling back to 9 days, as if the universe had decided that was my time limit. Other supplies: chemical toilet with 30 waste bags, cleaning supplies, duct tape, plastic sheeting, batteries, flashlights, weather radio, blankets, portable heater that ran on the bridge's electrical system. The room itself was maybe 12 feet by 8 feet, with windows on 2 sides, the door on the 3rd, and the interior wall against the tower structure on the 4th. Insulated, climate-controlled, wired into the bridge's backup power systems. It had been designed as a workplace, but it contained most of what I'd need for short-term survival. Short-term, I kept coming back to that qualifier. I tried calling my wife again. Network still overloaded. Try my supervisor, my brother, my parents. Nothing connected. Sent more texts that probably didn't deliver. Power still on. Have supplies. Don't worry. Who was I telling not to worry? Them or myself? The windows drew me back. I couldn't stop watching, even though each observation made the situation more incomprehensible. The bridge deck was filling with people now, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Hard to judge the total number from this angle. Most moved with that wrong, infected motion. Some still ran, still fought, still tried to escape, but fewer with each passing hour. A group of survivors, maybe 20 people, moving together in a tight cluster, tried to cross the bridge on foot, staying in the center of the pedestrian walkway. They made it about halfway, before infected began converging from both directions. The survivors ran. Most reached the southern approach. 3 didn't. I watched through binoculars as they were pulled down, overwhelmed, consumed by a crowd that seemed to materialize out of the gridlock. The mechanical efficiency of it disturbed me more than the violence. The infected didn't waste motion, didn't hesitate, didn't show any emotion except that singular focus on reaching and catching the uninfected. They were like systems running optimized code. Find target, pursue target, acquire target, repeat. A helicopter appeared around 4 p.m., flying low over the river. Military, based on the profile and the guns mounted on its sides. It circled the bridge once, and every infected on the deck turned to track its movement, heads following its path in synchronized motion that made my skin crawl. The helicopter moved toward the city center and disappeared behind the smoke columns. I never saw it return. What I understood then, sitting in my maintenance room with my 9 days of supplies, was that rescue wasn't coming. Not soon, maybe not ever. Whatever had happened was too big, too widespread, too complete for normal emergency response. The systems had failed. Dispatch, police, hospitals, all the infrastructure that separated civilization from chaos. The bridge's automated systems kept running. The lights came on at dusk, illuminating the horror on the deck below. Sodium vapor lamps, turning the scene into a high-contrast nightmare of orange light and black shadows. Hundreds of infected wandering between abandoned vehicles, some feeding on the people they'd caught, others standing motionless or walking in slow circles. I made myself keep watching, made myself understand what I was seeing, catalog the patterns, learn the rules of this new reality. Because I was stranded 200 feet above it with 9 days of supplies, and learning might be the difference between dying on day 10 and surviving longer. The infected didn't climb. That was important. They stayed on the deck, on the approaches at ground level. The tower ladder required complex motor skills, grip strength, coordination, sequential problem solving. They had none of those things. They responded to sound. A car alarm went off somewhere in the gridlock. Battery finally dying or short circuit triggered by damage, and dozens of infected converged on the noise, clustering around the vehicle, some beating on the doors and windows. They responded to light. Someone in a trapped vehicle turned on their headlights, and the infected moved toward the illumination like moths, surrounding the car until the lights went off again. Sound and light meant presence. Presence meant prey. The equation was simple and terrifying. I turned off all lights in the maintenance room except for one small LED lantern, positioned it away from the windows, and hung dark blankets over the glass using duct tape and safety clips. The room became a cave, dim and close, but invisible from below. I tried to sleep around midnight, lying on the foam equipment mat with the emergency blanket pulled over me. Every sound made me flinch, the bridge's structural creaking, the wind against the tower, the distant crashes and screams from the deck below. I woke every hour to check the door lock, the window coverings, the ladder access hatch. The maintenance journal sat on the desk, my technical observations replaced by survival calculations and behavioral notes about the infected. I'd stopped logging bridge status. The bridge was fine. The world using the bridge had ended. I didn't actually sleep that first night. I moved through periods of shallow unconsciousness interrupted by full alertness whenever the bridge's ambient sounds changed patterns. The structure spoke constantly, metal expanding and contracting with temperature shifts, cables humming in the wind, expansion joints clicking as vehicles on the deck, or bodies, or infected wandering in circles, shifted weight distribution. After 3 years of maintenance work, I knew the bridge's voice could distinguish normal structural conversation from sounds that meant problems. That night, every sound meant problems. I turned off the LED lantern around 1 a.m., preferring total darkness to even the small risk of light leaking through the blanket-covered windows. The maintenance room became an absolute void, the kind of darkness where you lost track of your body's position in space. I lay on the foam mat with my eyes open or closed. It made no difference, and listened to the chaos on the bridge deck filtering up through 200 feet of steel and concrete and night air. Screaming, sometimes. Crashes often. The The hollow thump of bodies hitting vehicles. Breaking glass. Once what sounded like gunfire, a rapid sequence of pops that echoed off the water and then stopped abruptly. I didn't look. I'd learned enough from my daylight observations. The darkness gave me permission to not witness, to compress my world down to the 12 by 8 box around me and pretend nothing existed beyond it. Around 3 a.m., something hit the tower structure. Not close, maybe 30 feet below my position, but loud enough to transmit through the steel as vibration. Then again, then a scraping sound, metal on metal, like something dragging itself against the tower's exterior. I stood up in the darkness, moved to the wall, pressed my ear against the cool metal. The scraping continued for maybe 2 minutes, then stopped. Silence, except for the wind and the distant sounds from the deck. I waited 10 minutes before allowing myself to sit back down. My heart rate had spiked to the point where I could feel my pulse in my throat, my wrists, my temples. Whatever had hit the tower hadn't reached me. Couldn't reach me, but the proximity shattered any illusion of absolute safety. The tower was tall. The ladder was complex. The infected couldn't climb. I repeated these facts like a prayer and tried to make myself believe them completely. Dawn came as a gradual lessening of the absolute darkness. Gray light filtering through gaps in the blanket coverings. I stood up, stiff from the foam mat, my back complaining about 42 years of age and a night spent on inadequate cushioning, and carefully pulled back one corner of a blanket to look outside. Fog had moved in overnight, thick enough to reduce visibility to maybe 100 feet. The bridge deck disappeared into white nothing in both directions. What I could see looked like a battlefield after the battle ended. Abandoned vehicles at random angles, bodies on the pavement. I counted 11 before stopping, and the infected. They'd changed overnight, or my understanding of them had changed. During daylight, they'd moved with purpose, hunting, pursuing, feeding. Now they mostly stood in place, scattered across the visible section of deck like statues someone had arranged without pattern. A few wandered slowly, but most were motionless, heads lowered, arms hanging at their sides. I watched one standing beside a minivan for 20 minutes without moving. Then it turned very slowly and walked 5 steps before stopping again. The motion looked mechanical, automated, like a program running through predetermined steps. Were they sleeping? Resting? Conserving energy? I had no framework for understanding what they were doing, but the stillness was almost worse than the hunting. At least hunting was explicable. Predator seeks prey, simple biological drive. This standing, this waiting implied something else. Patience, strategy, capacity for something more complex than pure instinct. I let the blanket fall back and turn to my supplies. Breakfast was a quarter of one emergency ration package, 600 calories of dense bar that tasted like sawdust mixed with artificial vanilla, and 8 ounces of water. The chemical toilet was behind a privacy screen I'd rig using a tarp and bungee cords. Using it felt vulnerable, exposed, even though I was alone in a locked room, 200 feet above danger. The weather radio still pulled nothing but static and occasional automated warnings. Remain indoors. Avoid contact with affected individuals. Emergency services are responding. Do not attempt to leave your shelter. The lies were almost comforting. Someone somewhere was still broadcasting them, which meant some infrastructure still functioned. Or it meant the automated systems were playing recordings to empty air while everyone who'd set them up was dead or infected. I chose to believe the former and try not to think about the latter. By mid-morning, the fog had burned off enough to extend my visibility. The bridge deck was less crowded than it had been at dusk. Maybe 100 infected instead of several hundred. The rest had wandered off, following whatever impulse or stimulus moved them. The bodies remained where they'd fallen. I pulled out the maintenance journal and started documenting what I'd observed, trying to establish patterns. Infected movement. Active during day, mostly stationary at night. Respond to sound and light. No observed climbing behavior. Attack normal humans on sight. Feeding behavior. 5 to 15 minutes per victim. Post-feeding. Return to wandering state. The clinical language helped me process what I'd seen. Turn horror into data. Trauma into technical observations. If I could understand them, I could predict them. If I could predict them, I could survive them. I spent the rest of the day watching and documenting, rationing my supplies, and trying not to calculate how many days I had left. The numbers kept intruding anyway. 8 days of food now, assuming no change in consumption. 8 days of water, assuming no additional sources. 8 days until I'd have to make a decision about whether to stay in this increasingly small room or try to reach ground level and scavenge for more supplies. The thought of descending the tower ladder, exposing myself to the deck, moving through that wandering crowd of infected, it seemed impossible. Suicidal. Better to stay here, conserve, wait for rescue that probably wasn't coming. I watched the sun set through a gap in the blanket, the sky turning orange with the glow of fires still burning across the city. The bridge lights came on automatically, and the infected began to move again, their nighttime restlessness returning as darkness fell. That night, I slept slightly better, in the sense that I achieved unconsciousness for periods longer than 20 minutes. My dreams were full of falling and climbing in towers that went up forever, while things with wrong movements waited at both top and bottom. I woke at dawn to Thursday, my second full day of isolation, and realized I couldn't hear any traffic sound from the city. No distant rumble of vehicles, no horns, no sirens. Just wind and water and the bridge's structural conversation. The silence was absolute. Thursday morning came with fog again, as if the weather had decided to match the world's mood. I stood at the window with the blanket pulled back just enough for binoculars, watching infected move through white nothing like sharks in murky water, visible for a moment, then swallowed by fog, then emerging somewhere else entirely. I'd started keeping systematic notes about their behavior, dedicating a section of the maintenance journal to observations. It gave structure to the days, purpose beyond pure survival. I was collecting data, conducting an involuntary field study, documenting a phenomenon I didn't understand but could at least measure. The infected moved in patterns, not random wandering, though it looked random at first. I tracked one for 45 minutes, a man in a torn dress shirt, left arm hanging at a wrong angle, and mapped his route across a section of deck. He walked in a rough circle, maybe 200 feet in diameter, returning to the same cluster of vehicles every 12 to 15 minutes. Each circuit took him past 3 bodies and twice across the pedestrian walkway. He didn't deviate, didn't react to anything outside his circle, just walked the same path over and over. Others showed similar behaviors. A woman in a blue postal worker uniform walked back and forth along a 50-foot section of bridge railing, turning at the same points each time. A teenage boy stood beside a pickup truck, absolutely motionless except for his head, which tracked any movement in his visible range with mechanical precision. They were patrolling. That was the word that kept occurring to me. Not wandering, patrolling territory, maintaining coverage of assigned zones, demonstrating something that looked uncomfortably like tactical positioning. Sound triggered immediate response. A car's anti-theft system activated somewhere in the gridlock, motion sensor or dying battery, something causing it to cycle through its alarm sequence. Every infected within my field of view turned toward the sound. They didn't run, but they all moved in the same direction with unified purpose, converging on the noise source. I watched through binoculars as maybe 30 of them clustered around a silver Honda, their bodies pressing against its doors and windows, hands slapping the metal, heads tilting as if listening for occupants. The alarm cycled for 2 minutes before stopping. The infected remained around the car for another 5 minutes, then gradually dispersed back to their patrol patterns. Nobody had been in the car. They'd responded to the alarm itself, not to any actual prey. That was useful information. Sound drew them, but they couldn't distinguish between meaningful threats and mechanical noise. They reacted to stimulus without evaluating whether the stimulus mattered. Light produced similar results. Someone, a survivor, had to turn on a flashlight inside a van, maybe 300 feet from my position. I saw the beam moving inside the vehicle, visible through the windows. Infected moved toward it like iron filings pulled by a magnet. The light went off quickly, but not quickly enough. They surrounded the van, maybe 15 of them pressing against the doors. The van rocked slightly. Whoever was inside was moving, maybe trying to get to the driver's seat. The infected began beating on the windows, their movements synchronized in a way that made my stomach turn. Not coordinated through communication, but coordinated through shared purpose, like ants converging on food. One window broke. I looked away. While I looked back, the van was still, the infected dispersing, several of them with dark stains on their clothes and hands. I wrote it all down. Light equals attention. Sound equals attention. Both trigger convergence behavior. Response time, immediate. Dispersal time after stimulus removal, 5 to 7 minutes. Attack duration, variable, dependent on victim resistance. The clinical language didn't make it easier, but it made it bearable. I've been eating one emergency ration per day, 2,400 calories split into 3 meals. That left 5 rations, 5 days of food. Water consumption was a gallon per day. Drinking, minimal hygiene, dampening a cloth to wipe my face and hands. 8 gallons left, 8 days of water. The numbers weren't adding up in my favor. 5 days of food, 8 days of water, and then what? Hope rescue arrived in that narrow window. Hope the infected wandered away. Hope I could survive on bridge equipment and rainwater. I started calculating calories more carefully. Human survival minimum was around 1,500 calories per day for someone sedentary, which I was. I could stretch each ration across 2 days, make 5 rations last 10 days. Drink 3 quarts per day instead of a gallon. Make the water last 12 days. 12 days. That was the new number. 12 days until I had to make a decision about descending. The bridge's electrical systems were still running on backup power, automated systems, designed to keep the structure safe even during power outages. The maintenance room's climate control continued working. The deck lights came on at dusk, went off at dawn. The cable tension monitors displayed their constant readouts as if the world was normal and someone might care about dampener pressure. I checked the monitors out of habit, found myself logging the data in the journal even though it served no purpose. The bridge was fine, structurally sound, load capacity barely tested with traffic stopped, cables well within normal parameters. If humanity went extinct tomorrow, this bridge would stand for 100 years. That thought was strangely comforting. I spent Thursday afternoon exploring what I could reach without leaving the maintenance room. The tower had internal conduits for electrical and data lines, narrow passages a person could squeeze through if necessary. I found one behind the equipment locker, maybe 18 inches square, running vertically through the tower structure. I cleared the locker, stacked the equipment against another wall, and peered into the conduit with a flashlight. It descended into darkness, presumably connecting to lower levels of the tower. Cables ran along one wall. The other 3 walls were bare concrete, slightly damp, smelling of dust and old metal. This was my emergency exit if the door failed, if infected somehow climbed the exterior ladder, if I needed to move deeper into the tower structure. The thought of squeezing through that narrow passage terrified me, but not as much as being trapped in the room with no alternative. I marked the conduit entrance with reflective tape, made sure I could remove the equipment locker quickly if needed, and went back to the window. The fog was clearing. The sun broke through in shafts of light that illuminated sections of the bridge deck like spotlights on a stage. Bodies lay where they'd fallen. Vehicles sat abandoned. Infected walked their patrol patterns. And I sat 200 feet above it all, taking notes, counting calories, trying to make 12 days stretch to 13. The sound cut through my afternoon documentation. A distant rhythmic thumping that didn't match any of the bridge's structural sounds I'd learned over 3 days of constant listening. I stopped writing mid-sentence and tilted my head, trying to identify the source and direction. Rotor blades, getting louder. I moved to the window, pulled back the blanket covering enough to press the binoculars to the glass. The helicopter appeared from the north, flying low over the city, maybe 300 feet above the buildings. Military configuration. I'd seen enough news footage of war zones to recognize the profile. 2-door, gunners visible, weapon systems mounted on the sides, olive drab paint job that meant official response rather than media or civilian. For exactly 3 seconds, I felt hope. Then I watched what happened next and understood why hope was dangerous. The 10:50 a.m. helicopter circled the bridge, maintaining its altitude, clearly surveying the situation. Every infected on the visible section of deck turned to track its movement. Not just looking, turning their entire bodies to follow its path. Heads tilted up, arms reaching toward the sound even though it was far beyond their reach. The synchronized motion made my skin crawl. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands across the full length of the bridge, all responding to the same stimulus with identical behavior. They looked like flowers tracking the sun, except flowers weren't predators and the sun wasn't prey. I considered signaling. Had a road flare in the emergency kit, could break the window, light it, wave it to get their attention. 3 seconds of hope had made me think rescue, extraction, helicopter lifting me away from this tower and carrying me to whatever safe zone the military had established. But I didn't move to get the flare. I just watched through the binoculars as the helicopter circled once more, then accelerated toward the city center where the smoke columns had been rising for 3 days. Every infected followed its path until it disappeared behind the downtown buildings. Then, slowly, they returned to their patrol patterns, their standing positions, their waiting. The sound faded. The bridge returned to its ambient noise, wind, water, structural creaking, the occasional crash or scream from somewhere in the gridlock. I lowered the binoculars and sat on the floor with my back against the wall. The helicopter had brought every infected into unified, coordinated response. The sound had created a convergence point that would have turned deadly for anyone at ground level. If I'd signaled, if they decided to extract me, they would have had to bring the helicopter close enough to reach the tower, and that would have drawn every infected on the bridge to this exact position. My safety depended on invisibility, on being 200 feet above notice, on generating no sound or light or movement that registered as presence to the infected below. The maintenance room was safe because nobody, living or dead, military or civilian, human or infected, knew I was here. Rescue meant exposure. Exposure meant death. I pulled out the journal and wrote. Helicopter sighted 2:15 p.m. Thursday. Did not signal. Survival requires isolation. Attention equals danger. The words looked stark on the page, a declaration of permanent solitude rendered in mechanical pencil. But they were true. I'd already understood this abstractly, but watching the infected track the helicopter had made it concrete. Sound drew them. Movement drew them. My position was only safe as long as I remained invisible, silent, forgotten. I thought about my wife, my supervisor, my brother, anyone who might be looking for me or wondering if I was alive. They couldn't know where I was. Telling them would require communication, and communication would require signal, and signal would draw attention. Better they thought I was dead. Better I actually was dead from their perspective, because dead people don't need rescue, and rescue was the most dangerous thing that could happen to me now. I spent the rest of the afternoon cataloging the tower's interior supplies more thoroughly. If I was choosing isolation, I needed to know everything this structure contained. The maintenance room was well stocked for temporary occupation, but I'd noticed during my earlier exploration that the tower had multiple levels, multiple storage areas, places I'd never paid attention to because they were someone else's responsibility or weren't relevant to my specific maintenance duties. The tower was over 200 feet tall. I occupied a room at roughly the 200-foot level. Below me, at various intervals, were other platforms, other access points, other spaces that might contain supplies. I found the structural plans in a drawer under the desk, faded blueprints from 1987, showing the tower's internal layout. For major platforms at 50-foot intervals, ground level, 50 feet, 100 feet, 150 feet, and my level at 200 feet. Each platform had storage areas, equipment lockers, access to different parts of the cable system. I'd only ever used my level. The rest of the tower was technically accessible, but practically forgotten, serviced by specialized crews who came maybe twice a year for deep inspections. If I could reach those lower levels safely, using internal ladders and conduits rather than the exterior access, I might find additional supplies. Water, food, equipment, anything that extended my 12 days to something longer. But reaching them meant descending, moving through the tower's internal spaces, making noise, taking risks. And it meant planning carefully, because once I left this room, I couldn't guarantee I'd be able to return to it if something went wrong. I studied the blueprints until the light faded, memorizing the tower's internal geography, identifying possible routes and potential obstacles. The conduit I'd found behind the equipment locker connected to the 150-foot platform. From there, an interior maintenance ladder descended to the 100-foot level. Another conduit dropped to 50 feet. Ground level was accessible, but would put me in line of sight of the bridge deck. Too dangerous. The 50-foot platform was my target. Far enough down to access different supply caches. High enough to remain above the infected's reach or notice, accessible through interior passages that wouldn't expose me to the deck. I decided to make the attempt Friday morning, early, before dawn, when the infected were in their nighttime standing pattern. Maximum safety, minimum visibility, best chance of moving through the tower without being noticed. The helicopter sound had taught me a valuable lesson. Sound traveled far, drew attention universally, made safety impossible. My survival depended on being quieter than the ambient noise of wind and bridge structure, smaller than the threshold of infected perception. I could do that. I've been doing it for 3 days already, sitting in this room like a ghost, breathing quietly, moving minimally, existing in the spaces between notice. I ate my evening ration, 600 calories of sawdust bar, and drank my measured 8 ounces of water. Outside, the bridge lights came on, illuminating the deck below. The infected began their nighttime wandering, more active than during the day, moving between vehicles with purpose I still didn't fully understand. I watched them until dark, learning their patterns, mapping their patrol routes, preparing for tomorrow's descent into the tower's depths. If I could find more supplies, I could extend 12 days to 20 to 30 to however long it took for the infected to die or leave or for whatever passed for rescue to become safe again. If I couldn't find supplies, at least I'd know what was possible and what wasn't. The tower creaked around me as temperature dropped, metal contracting in the night air. I lay on my foam mat and listened to the bridge's voice, trying to distinguish its normal sound from anything that might indicate danger approaching. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by dreams of helicopters and climbing and things that tracked movement with mechanical precision. Friday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of November dawn that turned breath visible and made metal surfaces painful to touch. I'd been awake since 4, preparing for my descent into the tower's lower levels, organizing equipment and reviewing the blueprint routes I'd memorized by flashlight the night before. I needed to move before dawn, while the infected were in their minimal activity state, before the bridge lights shut off and made navigating the interior passages more difficult. The timing was tight, maybe a 2-hour window between optimal visibility and dangerous exposure. I gathered what I'd need: flashlight with red filter to preserve night vision, multi-tool, notepad and pencil, empty backpack for carrying supplies, climbing harness in case I encounter vertical sections more challenging than the blueprint suggested. I dressed in dark colors, soft fabrics that wouldn't rustle or scrape against concrete. The equipment locker moved aside easily. I'd practiced the motion twice during the night, making sure I could clear the conduit entrance quickly and quietly. The opening behind it looked smaller than I remembered, an 18-inch square of absolute darkness descending into the tower's interior. I clipped the flashlight to my harness, tested the red filter one more time, and squeezed into the conduit feet first. The passage was tight enough that my shoulders brushed both side walls simultaneously. I descended by bracing my back against one wall and my feet against the opposite, inching down in controlled slides, the technique called chimmying that I'd learned during a rock climbing phase 20 years ago. The cables along one wall provided occasional handholds, though I was careful not to put weight on them. There were data lines, not structural supports. 15 feet down, the conduit opened into a larger space. The 150-foot platform, exactly where the blueprints had indicated. I dropped the last few feet and landed in a crouch, flashlight sweeping the darkness. The platform was maybe 20 feet square, open to the tower's interior structure, catwalks and cable connections visible in the red-tinted light. Dust covered everything, undisturbed by human presence for months or years. My footprints in the dust looked wrong, too fresh, evidence of activity where none should exist. I found a maintenance locker on the far wall, forced the rusted lock with my multi-tool, and opened it to reveal shelves of supplies. More emergency rations, these dated 2021, only 4 years old, probably still edible. Water purification tablets in a sealed container. Thermal blankets in vacuum packaging. A coil of rope. Mechanical tools, I already had duplicates of in my room. I loaded everything into the backpack except the tools, then moved to the interior ladder that descended to the 100-foot platform. This ladder was permanent steel construction, bolted to the tower's structural frame, designed for regular access. I climbed down slowly, testing each rung before committing weight, aware that any sound might echo through the tower's interior and transmit to the outside. The 100-foot platform was larger, a staging area for major cable maintenance work. I found 2 more supply lockers, both locked with combination padlocks that took me 20 minutes to open using a method I'd learned from a YouTube video years ago. Shimming the shackle with a piece of aluminum from a soda I'd saved in my toolkit specifically because the technique seemed useful. Inside, more rations dated 2020, sealed water containers, another first aid kit, a battery-powered radio, extra flashlights, a portable camp stove with fuel canisters, and a heavy winter coat size for someone much larger than me, but still potentially useful. My backpack was getting heavy. I redistributed the weight, prioritized food and water, left some of the redundant items for potential later retrieval. The conduit to the 50-foot platform was narrower than the first one, requiring me to remove the backpack and push it ahead while I crawled. The passage angled slightly, following the tower's structural geometry, and opened into darkness that the flashlight couldn't immediately penetrate. I emerged onto a platform different from the others. Older construction, predating the 1987 renovation, covered in layers of paint and rust and abandoned equipment from previous maintenance eras. The air smelled of water damage and decay, suggesting this level wasn't as well sealed as the upper platforms. The supply locker here was ancient, a steel cabinet with a padlock so rusted that it broke when I tried to shim it. Inside, water containers with questionable seals. I marked these for testing before consumption. Military ration from some disaster preparedness initiative in the 1990s, a folded tarp, bundles of cable ties, more rope, and at the very back, a sealed case labeled Emergency Cash Bridge Authority 2018. I opened the case carefully, expecting to find more of the same supplies I'd already collected. Instead, vacuum-sealed camping meals, the kind that required only hot water, a water filtration pump with replacement filters, a compact camping stove with fuel tablets, fire-starting equipment, an actual sleeping bag, and 6 sealed bottles of water treatment chemicals. Someone had prepared this cache with real survival in mind. Not just wait out a storm supplies, but live in the tower for weeks supplies. I wondered if they'd anticipated exactly this kind of situation, or if they'd just been paranoid enough to over-prepare for generic disasters. I repacked everything, keeping the camping meals and filtration pump, noting the location of everything else for future retrieval. My backpack weighed maybe 40 pounds now, heavy but manageable for the climb back to my room. The return trip took longer than the descent. Climbing upward through tight conduits with a loaded backpack tested both my strength and my claustrophobia. I had to stop twice to rest, wedged into the narrow passages, breathing dust, and fighting the urge to panic about being stuck. I emerged into my maintenance room at 7:15 a.m., 2 hours and 45 minutes after starting the descent. My arms shook from the effort of climbing. My shoulders were scraped raw from the tight passages. But the backpack contained enough supplies to extend my survival timeline from 12 days to at least 30, possibly longer if I rationed carefully. I spread everything on the floor and conducted inventory. Food, 8 additional emergency rations, 14 vacuum-sealed camping meals, various granola bars, and snack items. combined with what I already had, maybe 50,000 calories total. At 1,500 calories per day, 33 days of food. Water, 6 sealed gallons from the lower platforms, water treatment chemicals, filtration pump with filters. Combined with my existing supply and the ability to filter questionable water or collect rainwater. Indefinite supply, assuming precipitation and careful sanitation. Equipment, additional blankets, rope, tools, first aid supplies, the sleeping bag, the camping stove. I transformed my situation from 12 days until crisis to 30-plus days of stable survival with expansion possibilities. The radio I'd found on the 100-foot platform was a better model than my weather radio. More frequencies, stronger reception, better battery life. I turned it on and scanned through the spectrum, looking for any sign of functioning communication. Static, pure static across every frequency. Emergency bands and commercial stations and ham radio channels. No automated warnings anymore, no broadcasts of any kind. Just empty carrier waves or dead air. The silence was more disturbing than any message would have been. Static meant systems were still powered but unmanned. Dead air meant systems had failed completely. Either way, it confirmed what I'd suspected since watching the helicopter. Organized response had collapsed. Infrastructure had failed. Whatever government or military or emergency services had existed a week ago had either been destroyed or had abandoned this area entirely. I was on my own. Completely, absolutely, probably permanently. I logged the silence in my journal. Friday, November 15th. All communication channels silent. No automated broadcasts. No human response. Systemic infrastructure failure confirmed. Then I logged my supply discovery and calculated my new timeline. 33 days of food. Indefinite water. Secure position. No immediate threats beyond psychological isolation and eventual supply depletion. I could survive a month. If I found more supplies in sections of the tower I hadn't explored yet, I could survive longer. If I learned to supplement emergency rations with preserved food from the abandoned vehicles on the bridge deck, risky but possible, I could survive even longer. The maintenance room had stopped being a hiding place and started being a home. That realization felt significant enough to write in the journal without clinical distance. I've stopped waiting for rescue. I'm learning to live here instead. Outside, the dawn light revealed a bridge deck significantly less crowded than it had been the previous day. I counted maybe 50 infected in my visible range compared to hundreds earlier in the week. The rest had wandered off, following whatever impulse drove them, leaving behind the abandoned vehicles and bodies in silence. The bodies hadn't moved in 3 days. The infected ignored them completely now, having fed or lost interest or moved on to other prey elsewhere. Nature was beginning its work. I saw crows circling, landing on the deck, approaching the corpses with cautious hunger. Life continued. Death continued. The bridge stood solid and unchanging while everything on and around it transformed. I ate breakfast, one of the camping meals, chicken and rice that tasted like luxury after days of sawdust emergency bars, and settled in to watch the new patterns emerging on the deck below. The infected were changing, or my understanding of them was changing, or both. I spent Saturday performing the kind of detailed analysis that had made me good at bridge maintenance, systematic observation, precise measurement, careful calculation of long-term implications. Except instead of calculating cable stress and structural load, I was calculating human survival in an environment that had stopped supporting humans. The math was straightforward but uncomfortable. Food, 50,000 calories total. 1,500 calories per day minimum. Equals 33 days. Call it a month to account for rounding and the probability that some rations wouldn't be viable. December 15th was my hard stop unless I found more supplies. Water, 9 gallons remaining after my week of consumption, plus 6 more from the lower platforms, plus treatment chemicals and filtration pump. 15 gallons total, 3 quarts per day minimum, equals 20 days of guaranteed water. But with filtration capability and the potential for rain collection, this became indefinite, assuming I could maintain the equipment and find water sources. The water situation was actually better than the food situation. The maintenance room had a small sink connected to the bridge's emergency water system, probably contaminated now, but filterable. Rain fell regularly in November and December, and I'd already identified multiple surfaces on the tower that could serve as collection points. Food was the critical limitation, and food meant eventually leaving the tower or finding supplies on the bridge deck or resigning myself to slow starvation starting around mid-December. I studied the blueprints again, looking for spaces I hadn't explored. The tower had internal complexity I'd never needed to understand as a maintenance worker focused on cables and electrical systems. Ventilation shafts, structural voids, access passages to parts of the bridge I'd never visited. The cable inspection cupola above my room. I noted on the plans, but never accessed it, assuming it was locked or sealed or only accessible to the specialized crews who performed high-altitude cable work. But the blueprint showed an access hatch in my room's ceiling, concealed behind panels I'd never had reason to remove. I moved the desk, climbed on it, and studied the ceiling. Found the panel seams, worked them loose with my multi-tool, revealed a narrow vertical shaft with a ladder running up maybe 30 feet to another hatch. The cupola. Had to be. I climbed the ladder slowly, testing each rung, and emerged into a small enclosed space at the very top of the tower structure. Maybe 6 feet in diameter, with windows on all sides providing a full 360-degree view. This was where cable inspectors would sit during major structural assessments, watching the cables under different loads, checking for movement or stress signs that required closer examination. The view was extraordinary. I could see the entire bridge, both approaches, several miles of cityscape in each direction, the river spreading wide below, and on the horizon, the suggestion of mountains or hills that I'd never noticed from ground level. But more importantly, I could see supplies. The cupola contained its own small cache of equipment. Binoculars better than mine, a camera with telephoto lens, a small radio, also dead when I tried it, emergency flares, and 2 sealed containers marked extended observation supplies. Inside the containers, freeze-dried camping meals, a dozen of them, a portable water filter, energy bars, instant coffee, a compact camp stove with fuel tabs, a sleeping bag rated to 0 degrees, emergency blankets, first aid supplies, a thick notebook labeled Cable Observation Log, with entries dating back to 2015, the last entry from February 2024. Someone had spent days up here, watching the bridge, logging its behavior under different conditions. They'd stocked this position for exactly that kind of extended occupation. I loaded everything into my backpack except the sleeping bag, which I left in the cupola along with the binoculars and camera. This space was more defensible than my main room. Smaller, higher, accessible only through a ladder that required active climbing. If the main room was ever compromised, the cupola could serve as a final retreat. Back in my room, I recalculated additional food from cupola, maybe 15,000 calories. Combined total, 65,000 calories. At 1,500 per day, 43 days of food. Early January instead of mid-December. Still not indefinite. Still a hard stop unless I found more supplies or developed a way to supplement rations. I spent the rest of Saturday studying the bridge deck through the cupola's binoculars, looking for potential supply sources. The abandoned vehicles contained food. I'd seen lunchboxes, fast food bags, grocery bags, and back seats and trunks. The bodies, some of them had been carrying backpacks, purses, bags. Supplies existed on the deck, distributed across maybe 1,000 abandoned vehicles and 100 dead survivors. But reaching them meant descending to ground level, exposing myself to the infected who remained, taking risks that could end with me becoming another body on the pavement. I tried to think like an engineer instead of survivor. What systems would reduce risk? What approach would minimize exposure? What preparations would increase success probability? The bridge's cable system offered vertical access separate from the main tower ladder. Inspection teams used safety harnesses and mechanical ascenders to move along the cables during maintenance work. I had the equipment: harness, ropes, ascenders, carabiners. I had the knowledge, having watched inspection crews work, and having read the safety manuals. I could theoretically descend via cable to the deck level, access vehicles at the tower's base where infected presence was minimal, gather supplies quickly, and ascend back to safety before drawing significant attention. Theoretically, the reality involved dangling 200 feet above the deck on a cable designed for controlled professional work, not desperate supply runs. It involved making noise, carabiners clicking against metal, ropes sliding through harness points, my own breathing amplified by exertion. It involved being visible, exposed, vulnerable for the entire duration of the descent and ascent. It seemed like suicide, but so did starving to death in early January. I decided to study the approach for several days before attempting it. Watch the infected patterns, identify the lowest activity periods, practice the equipment setup in my room until the movements became automatic, plan exact routes and timing and contingencies. Sunday was observation day. I spent 12 hours in the cupola, logging every infected movement in my visible range, mapping their patrol patterns, identifying gaps and opportunities, and zones of maximum danger. The deck had maybe 30 infected remaining in the sections I could see clearly. Most maintained regular patrol patterns, walking fixed routes, returning to specific locations, demonstrating territorial behavior. A few stood motionless for hours, like statues someone had placed randomly. Two appeared to be feeding on something, though I didn't look too closely at what. The pattern I noticed, they avoided the areas directly beneath the towers. Not completely, they'd pass through occasionally, but they didn't linger there, didn't patrol those specific zones with the same intensity as other areas. Why? The tower's shadow, some structural feature that made the space uncomfortable? Residual sound from the bridges systems that was below my hearing threshold, but registered to infected senses? I didn't know, but I could use it. Monday was preparation day. I set up the cable access equipment in my room, practiced the harness procedures, tested the ascenders, checked every carabiner, and roped for wear or damage. I packed a smaller bag, just essentials for a quick descent, and staged it near the access point. Tuesday was decision day. I would either attempt the supply run or accept that my 43 days of food were final and plan accordingly. I spent Tuesday morning in the cupola, watching the pre-dawn infected patterns. Their nighttime activity was minimal, mostly standing in place. Dawn seemed to trigger increased movement. Late afternoon showed peak activity. Evening brought return to stillness. Pre-dawn, that was my window. Between 5 and 6 a.m., when darkness was lifting but the bridge lights were off, when infected were in minimal activity mode, when I could move with the advantage of changing light conditions. Wednesday morning. I'd make the attempt Wednesday morning. I wrote the plan in my journal, detailed steps and timing and contingencies. If something went wrong, if I didn't return, the journal would at least document what I tried and why. Some future person finding this room would know I hadn't simply given up and died. I made calculated attempts to extend survival. That mattered to me in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Not heroism. I wasn't trying to be brave. Just documentation. Evidence that I'd thought things through, made rational choices, played the statistical odds as well as possible. I ate dinner. One of the freeze-dried camping meals, beef stew that was surprisingly decent, and tried to sleep early. Tomorrow meant descending into danger. Tomorrow meant taking risks I'd been avoiding for 2 weeks. Tomorrow meant finding out if my 43 days could become 60, 80, indefinite. The tower creaked around me in familiar patterns. The infected wandered below in their mysterious routines. The bridge stood solid, holding me 200 feet above a world I'd stopped understanding but was learning to survive. I woke at 4:30 Wednesday morning without an alarm. My body, apparently having decided this was important enough to overcome my usual habit of sleeping until dawn. I lay in the darkness for 10 minutes, running through the procedure one more time, making sure each step was clear and automatic. The plan was simple in concept. Use the bridge's cable inspection access to descend along the main suspension cable to the tower's base, gather supplies from abandoned vehicles in the shadow zone, ascend back to safety. 30 minutes maximum exposure, hopefully less. In execution, It was anything but simple. I dressed in dark, quiet clothing, soft pants, long sleeves, gloves to prevent rope burn and protect against the cold morning air. The harness went on over everything, checked twice for proper adjustment. I clipped on the equipment, 2 ascenders, backup safety rope, carabiners rated for climbing falls, the small supply pack with empty space for whatever I could carry back. The cable access point was on the external face of the tower, reached through a maintenance door I'd never opened. I unlocked it as quietly as possible and stepped out onto a small platform, maybe 3 feet square. The morning air hit me immediately, cold enough to sting, carrying the smell of the river and smoke and something organic I didn't want to identify. The main suspension cable was a massive steel rope as thick as my torso, dropping away from the tower at a steep angle down to the bridge deck. The inspection crews attached their equipment to a secondary cable that ran parallel, designed specifically for safety lines. I clipped my harness to this secondary cable using both ascenders, mechanical devices that slid down easily but locked under upward force, preventing falls. Below me, the bridge deck spread out in gray pre-dawn light. I could see infected scattered across the visible range, most standing motionless in their nighttime positions. The area directly beneath the tower looked empty. I took a breath, rechecked my equipment one final time, and stepped off the platform. The ascenders caught immediately, holding me suspended on the cable as I'd known they would, but still producing a spike of adrenaline. I was dangling 200 feet above concrete and steel and infected, held by equipment I trusted but had never personally tested in serious conditions. I descended in controlled intervals, slide the lower ascender down a foot, weight it, release the upper ascender, slide it down, transfer weight, repeat. The motion was smooth after a dozen repetitions, my body finding the rhythm, my breathing settling into the pattern of controlled exertion. 50 feet down, I paused to check the deck below. No movement directly beneath me. Several infected visible in my peripheral vision, but none close, none tracking my position. The mechanical clicking of the ascenders wasn't loud, no louder than the ambient sounds of wind against steel, but each click felt amplified by fear. 100 feet down, halfway, my arms were already feeling the strain. The ascenders did most of the work, but maintaining position still required constant grip strength. I paused again, hung on my harness, let my arms rest for 30 seconds while I scanned the area below. Still clear. A few infected wandering in the distance, none approaching. 150 feet down, the ground was close now, close enough to see details on the abandoned vehicles, the specific angles of body positions I'd been avoiding examining. 170 feet, 180. At 190 feet, I heard something change below me. Not movement sound, a low vocalization, somewhere between a groan and a hiss, coming from my left. I froze in position, locked both ascenders, and turned my head slowly to look. An infected had emerged from between 2 vehicles, maybe 30 feet away. Male, middle-aged, wearing torn business clothes, moving with that characteristic wrong motion. His head was up, scanning, responding to some stimulus I couldn't identify. The clicks. He'd heard the ascender clicks, or felt the vibration through the cable system, or noticed some other aspect of my descent. He moved toward the base of the tower, not directly at me, but in my general direction, head still tilting, still searching. Another infected appeared from behind a van, this one female, also heading toward the tower base with that same searching posture. I had maybe 20 feet left to descend, 20 feet to reach the deck level, access the vehicles, gather supplies, and ascend back up before more infected converged. The math wasn't working in my favor anymore. I made a decision. Abort the ground-level approach. Access supplies from height instead. The vehicles closest to the tower were mostly sedans and small trucks. I could reach their roofs from about 15 feet up if I swung on the cable, land on a roof, access what I could through windows, and ascend back without ever touching the ground. It wasn't the plan, but plans changed when circumstances shifted. I descended the last 10 feet faster than safe, felt the jarring stop as my feet swung past the lowest point, used the momentum to swing toward a white sedan parked directly beneath the cable's path. released one ascender at exactly the right moment, dropped onto the sedan's roof with a thump that was far too loud. The roof dented under my impact. The sound echoed. Every infected in hearing range turned toward me. I didn't waste time assessing the situation, just moved. The sedan's back window was already broken, probably from the chaos 2 weeks ago. I reached through, grabbed the first bag I found, a backpack, heavy, probably full of actual supplies rather than personal items. Pulled it out, clipped it to my harness, reached through again and grabbed a lunchbox from the front seat. Clipped it. The infected were approaching from multiple directions now. Maybe 10 of them converging on the sedan, their movements accelerating from patrol walk to something faster. Not running, but purposeful, closing the distance. I reattached both ascenders to the secondary cable, locked them, and started climbing. The ascenders made climbing efficient, but not fast. Each upward motion required me to stand in the lower ascender, slide the upper one up as high as possible, lock it, sit back in the harness, slide the lower ascender up, repeat. Under ideal conditions, I could climb maybe 20 feet per minute. With adrenaline and terror driving me, I managed closer to 30. The infected reached the sedan as I passed 40 feet up. They clustered around it, some beating on the doors, others tilting their heads up toward me. One of them climbed onto the hood with surprising coordination, then onto the roof, reaching upward even though I was well beyond range. I kept climbing. 60 feet, 80, 100. My arms burned. My breath came in gasps. My hands were cramping inside the gloves. But I climbed. At 150 feet, I looked down and saw that more infected had gathered below. Maybe 20 now, some still arriving, all clustered beneath my position. The one who'd climbed onto the sedan was still reaching upward, arms extended, mouth open. They'd marked this location. Even after I was safely back in my room, they'd remember something was here, something was above them, something had generated sound and movement. I just made my tower position known. The realization carried me through the last 50 feet on pure panic energy. I reached the small platform, clipped my harness to the safety rail, and hauled myself back through the maintenance door into the familiar space of my room. Slammed the door, locked it, leaned against it while my heart tried to break through my ribs. The backpack I grabbed contained 3 water bottles, 2 sandwiches in plastic wrap, a bag of chips, an apple, withered but probably still edible, and various personal items I dumped out immediately. Wallet, phone, keys, makeup bag. The lunchbox held a thermos of something that smelled spoiled, another sandwich, and a package of cookies. Maybe 3,000 calories total. 3 days of food, minus the spoiled items. I'd risked exposure, alerted the infected to my presence, and gained 3 days of food. The math was terrible. The strategic implications were worse. I moved to the window and looked down at the tower base. The infected were still there, 20 of them now, standing in a cluster, heads tilted up toward the tower. Not dispersing, not returning to patrol patterns, just standing, waiting for me. I'd changed the situation fundamentally. Before, I was invisible, forgotten, safely isolated. Now I was known. Now they were watching. I logged the failed supply, run in my journal, documented what I'd learned about cable descent, calculated my new food supply total. 43 days plus 3 days equals 46 days. Early January until I faced starvation. Then I sat on the floor and tried to figure out how to survive, knowing that I just taught the infected to pay attention to the tower that had been my sanctuary. The answer came slowly, over hours of thought. I couldn't go down anymore. Down was compromised, watched, dangerous. But the tower went up as well as down. The cupola. The cable system at higher elevations. The bridge deck had supplies, but so did the tower structure itself. If I looked in the right places and stopped thinking of descent as my only option. The bridge had saved me by accident. Now I had to save myself deliberately, using the structure as it was designed, a system of heights and cables and spaces that could support a person who understood how to move through them. I spent the rest of Wednesday exploring upward instead of downward, finding spaces I'd never known existed, discovering that survival sometimes meant abandoning obvious approaches for harder, stranger paths. The tower had more secrets to reveal. I just had to stop thinking like someone waiting for rescue and start thinking like someone who lived here permanently. By Thanksgiving, not that I was tracking holidays, but my phone's calendar still marked the date before the battery finally died on November 20th. I'd established something that resembled a routine. Not normal. Nothing about this was normal, but functional. A pattern of activity that filled the days and kept me from thinking too hard about the bigger implications of my situation. Dawn. Observation from the cupola. I moved half my time to the upper space, using it as a primary watch position while keeping the maintenance room as living quarters. The 360-degree view let me track infected movements across the full bridge length, identify patterns, note changes. The cluster at the tower base remained, sometimes 20 infected, sometimes 30, occasionally dropping to a dozen when some wandered off. But there were always some watching, waiting, remembering that something had been here. Morning, maintenance work. This seemed absurd at first, performing bridge maintenance when society had collapsed. But the work gave me purpose, and the bridge's systems needed attention whether civilization existed or not. I checked cable tensions, logged structural readings, cleaned equipment, documented everything in my journal. The bridge was functioning infrastructure, and I was its only remaining custodian. Midday, supply management and meal preparation. I gotten better at rationing, stretching my supplies further by accepting actual hunger rather than just reduced intake. 200 calories per day instead of 1,500, sometimes dropping to 1,000 on rest days. It was sustainable for months if necessary, though I'd emerge from it thinner and weaker. Afternoon, exploration and problem solving. The tower had revealed more spaces than I'd initially identified. Narrow passages, equipment voids, structural gaps that could be accessed with patience and flexibility. I found 2 more sealed supply caches, both containing preserved food and water, both extending my timeline. I'd also found spaces that could serve as secondary positions if the main room was ever compromised. Evening, observation and documentation. As the sun set and the bridge lights came on, the infected showed different behaviors, more active, more coordinated, more purposeful in their movements. I watched and logged, trying to understand what drove them, what patterns govern their actions. Night, rest and planning. Sleep came easier now, my body having adjusted to the constant low-level threat, accepting that I'd wake up to the same situation tomorrow and the day after that. The weather turned properly cold in late November. Morning temperatures dropped below freezing. The bridge deck developed patches of ice that made the infected slip and fall in darkly comedic ways. They couldn't adjust their movement to account for changed traction, just kept walking at the same pace and direction until they lost footing and went down. The cold brought a different threat. Hypothermia if my room's heating system failed. The bridge's backup power was still functioning, still providing climate control and lighting, but I knew it couldn't last forever. Backup systems had limits. Eventually, something would fail: fuel supplies, mechanical components, electrical connections. When that happened, I need alternative heat sources. I found them by exploring the cable inspection equipment more thoroughly. The inspection crews had used small portable heaters during cold weather cable work, propane-powered units designed for outdoor use. I discovered 3 of them in various storage areas, along with a dozen propane canisters. Enough fuel for weeks of supplemental heating if the main system failed. I also found more clothing in the equipment lockers, heavy work coats, insulated overalls, winter gloves rated for extreme cold. The bridge workers who'd stocked these positions had prepared for working in harsh conditions. Their preparations were keeping me alive. The food situation stabilized around December 1st. I'd found enough additional supplies to push my timeline to 60 days, early January, and had identified several potential sources for extension beyond that. The abandoned vehicles on the bridge deck still contained food, though accessing it remained problematic with the infected watching the tower. But I'd also realized that the bridge had service vehicles parked in maintenance bays at ground level, accessed through internal passages. If those vehicles contained supplies, or if the maintenance bays themselves held additional caches, I might push my timeline even further. Water was no longer a concern. The rain collection system I'd rigged using tarps and equipment containers provided a steady supply. Combined with the filtration pump and treatment chemicals, I had more water than I could use. I'd even started using it for actual hygiene, washing my face, my hands, occasionally running a wet cloth over the rest of me in a gesture toward cleanliness. The journal filled with technical observations. December 2nd, 23 infected at Tower Base. Cluster stable for 11 days. No dispersal pattern observed. Hypothesis, territorial marking behavior. December 4th, bridge deck ice causing infected movement difficulties. Falls observed, 17. No apparent learning or adaptation. Motor control appears fixed, unchangeable. December 6th, smoke columns from city reduced to 3 visible sources. Others extinguished naturally or burned out completely. No new fires observed in 72 hours. December 9th, first snow, light accumulation. Infected show no response to weather conditions. Continue normal patterns regardless of precipitation. The snow was beautiful in a way I hadn't appreciated before. It covered the deck, the vehicles, the bodies, transforming the bridge into something clean and quiet. The infected moved through it without leaving footprints that lasted. Their body heat melted the snow in contact, leaving dark tracks that filled in quickly. I watched them from the cupola, these figures moving through white landscape, and felt something unexpected, curiosity rather than fear. They were no longer just threats to be avoided. They were phenomena to be studied, behaviors to be cataloged, patterns to be understood. What had they been? The man in the business suit who patrolled a 50-foot circuit. Had he been an accountant, a manager, a banker? The woman who stood motionless near the bridge railing. Had she been a mother, a teacher, a friend to people who were now also infected or dead? I'd stopped thinking of them as people who'd changed and started thinking of them as something new. Not human anymore, but not mindless either. They had behaviors, patterns, something that looked like territory and routine and purpose. One afternoon in mid-December, I watched an infected man encounter an infected woman in the middle of the bridge deck. They approached each other, stopped maybe 5 feet apart, and stood facing each other for almost 10 minutes. No aggression, no interaction, just standing and looking. Then they walked away in different directions, returning to their separate patrol patterns. What had that been? Recognition? Communication? Some kind of interaction I didn't have the framework to interpret? I wrote it down. December 14th. Observed potential inter-infected communication. Nature unclear. Duration 9.5 minutes. No physical contact. Purpose unknown. The isolation was affecting me in ways I'd expected and ways I hadn't. Expected. Loneliness, the ache of having no one to talk to, the absence of human connection. Unexpected, a strange kind of peace. No decisions except the ones I made. No obligations except survival. No noise except the sound I chose to hear. I'd stopped missing my phone after the battery died. Stopped wondering about news or updates or what was happening elsewhere. Stopped thinking about rescue or return to normal life. The bridge had become my world. 200 feet of vertical space and the horizontal span I could see from the cupola. Everything else had faded to abstraction. My wife was either alive somewhere, adapting as I was adapting, or she was dead and worrying about it served no purpose. My brother, my parents, my supervisor, my friends, same calculation. Either they'd survived and I'd never know, or they hadn't and knowing would change nothing. That sounds cold, written out. It felt more like acceptance, like finally understanding what I could control, my immediate survival, my daily choices, my documentation of this experience, and what I couldn't, everything else. The maintenance journal had become half technical log, half personal diary. I wrote about the bridge's systems and my own thoughts without much distinction between them. December 18th. Cable dampener 7 still showing irregular readings. Should investigate after winter weather passes. Finding it hard to sleep lately. Not fear, just a restlessness, like I'm waiting for something to change, but don't know what the change would look like. December 20th. 30 days since outbreak began. 30 days since I climbed this tower for a routine inspection. 30 days of learning to live in a 12 by 8 room, 200 feet above a world that stopped making sense. The bridge is holding me. I'm holding the bridge. We're keeping each other functional. One night, I climbed to the cupola and watched the city lights, or the lack of them. No street lights, no building illumination, no signs of electrical power anywhere in my visible range. Just darkness, absolute and complete, broken only by the bridge's automated lights and the stars above. I've been a maintenance worker, a husband, a person with routines and responsibilities, and a mortgage. Now, I was whatever this was, a survivor, a custodian, a person who lived in a tower and watched infected wander below and wrote technical observations about the end of the world. The transformation had happened so gradually, I couldn't identify the exact moment when I'd stop being the first thing and become the second. Maybe there was no exact moment. Maybe it was just accumulation, each day adding to the previous days until I'd changed completely without noticing. I ate my dinner, freeze-dried stroganoff, surprisingly good, and made notes about tomorrow's plans. Explore the north side of the tower structure. Check the maintenance bays for additional supplies. Test the backup heating systems to ensure they'd work if needed. Practical tasks. Immediate concerns. The kind of planning that kept me functional. Outside, the infected walked their patterns through the December darkness. Inside, I wrote in my journal and checked my equipment and prepared for another day of survival. The bridge held me. I held the bridge. We were both functioning infrastructure in a world where most infrastructure had failed. That felt like enough. 6 weeks after the outbreak began, though I'd stopped thinking of it as outbreak and started thinking of it as the change since outbreak implied something temporary. I climbed to the cupola during a rare, clear morning and saw how far the transformation had spread. The binoculars I'd found in the cupola were excellent, professional-grade optics designed for precise cable inspection at distance. They brought distant objects into sharp focus, revealed details I couldn't see with naked eye. I've been using them to watch the bridge deck, the immediate approaches, the areas within maybe half a mile of my position. That morning, I pointed them toward the horizon instead. The city showed no lights, no movement, no signs of organized human activity anywhere in my visible range. I could see maybe 15 miles on a clear day, downtown buildings, residential neighborhoods, the industrial districts, the suburbs spreading toward the hills. All empty, all dark, all silent. Smoke still rose from a few locations, thinner than the massive columns of the first days, but persistent. Structure fires that had burned for weeks, or new fires started by electrical failures or gas leaks or other consequences of abandoned infrastructure. No firefighters responded. The buildings just burned until they ran out of fuel. The highways showed scattered vehicles, abandoned where they'd stopped, creating permanent traffic jams that nobody would ever clear. I traced one highway with the binoculars, following its curve toward the suburbs, and saw the same pattern. Cars, stillness, no movement. The suburbs themselves looked like ghost towns. Houses with open doors, yards with toys scattered across lawns, driveways with vehicles that would never move again. No people visible, neither normal nor infected. Just emptiness. I spent 3 hours that morning scanning the full 360-degree range, methodically checking each section, looking for any sign of organized survival. Smoke from inhabited buildings. Movement that suggested coordinated human activity. Lights at night. Anything that indicated functioning communities. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The realization built slowly, each observation adding to the accumulating weight. This wasn't temporary. There was no rescue coming. There were no functioning emergency services, no military securing safe zones, no government coordinating response. The systems had failed completely and permanently. Whatever society had existed before the change had been destroyed so thoroughly that no recognizable remnant remained. I was looking at a world that had ended. Not apocalypse in the dramatic sense. No nuclear explosions, no alien invasions, no asteroid impacts. Just the quiet collapse of every system that made civilization function, replaced by infected wandering through ruins and survivors hiding in whatever spaces they'd found and the vast, empty silence of infrastructure running on automation until it finally stopped. I lowered the binoculars and sat in the cupola's small space, trying to process what I'd seen, trying to understand what it meant for my survival calculations. Before, I'd been thinking in terms of months. Hold out until winter passed, until spring brought better weather and possibly better options. Stretch 60 days to 90 to however long my supplies could last. Wait for rescue or organized response or some indication that society was rebuilding. Now I understood. There was no timeline. There was no date when normal would resume. There was just the bridge, the tower, the infected below, and me in between. Indefinitely. Possibly permanently. The maintenance room wasn't a hiding spot until things returned to normal. It was my life now, for as long as I could maintain it. The bridge wasn't a structure I was temporarily stranded on. It was my territory, my resource, my home in a world that had stopped having homes in any conventional sense. I climbed back down to my room and looked at it with new perspective. 12 feet by 8 feet. One window facing north, one facing south. Small windows east and west. A door with a good lock. Climate control running on backup power. Cable tension monitors that nobody except me would ever read again. A foam mat I slept on. A chemical toilet behind a tarp. Supplies stacked against the walls. This was my home. Not temporarily. Permanently. That understanding changed everything. If this was permanent, I needed to think in terms of indefinite sustainability. Not 60 days of food, but reliable food sources that could last years. Not backup heating until spring, but heating systems I could maintain forever. Not waiting for rescue, but building permanent survival. The bridge had advantages I'd been underutilizing. Height, isolation, structural integrity, electrical systems, water access, storage spaces, defensive position. It was designed to support human occupation. Maintenance crews worked here for days at a time during major inspections. The infrastructure existed to sustain me, if I used it correctly. Height meant safety from infected. They couldn't climb, couldn't reach me, couldn't threaten me as long as I stayed above their range. The failed supply run had confirmed this. They'd been waiting at the tower base for 3 weeks now, a permanent guard I couldn't bypass, but they also couldn't ascend. The vertical distance was absolute protection. Isolation meant no other survivors could threaten me. I'd seen survivors crossing the bridge during the first weeks. Some probably made it to wherever they were going, others were caught and infected. But none had noticed me. Nobody had climbed the tower, searched the maintenance room, competed for resources. I was alone, truly alone, which was both problem and advantage. The bridge's electrical systems were powered by backup generators in the tower base, designed to keep essential systems running during power outages. The generators ran on stored fuel. Diesel, probably, though I'd never inspected them closely. That fuel would eventually run out, but eventually might mean months or years depending on consumption rate and storage capacity. When the power failed, I had alternatives: the propane heaters for warmth, hand-powered tools for mechanical work, daylight for illumination. The bridge could support me without electricity, though less comfortably. Water was solved. Rain collection and filtration gave me indefinite supply. Sanitation worked. The chemical toilet was maintainable as long as I had waste bags, and I'd found boxes of them in the lower platforms. Shelter worked. The maintenance room was weatherproof and insulated. Food was the critical problem. 60 days of emergency rations, then nothing. I needed sustainable food sources, or I needed to extend the emergency supplies far enough to reach. What? Spring? Summer? Some future point when scavenging became safer? I spent the afternoon thinking through food options. Option 1. Raid the bridge deck vehicles. High risk from infected, moderate reward. Maybe another 30 days of preserved food if I hit vehicles that have been used for grocery shopping or food delivery. Option 2. Explore the tower base maintenance areas via internal passages. Lower risk, unknown reward. The maintenance bays might contain break room supplies, vending machines, stored food for workers. Option 3. Extreme rationing. 800 calories per day would stretch 60 days to nearly 100, but would leave me weak malnourished, possibly unable to perform necessary maintenance or escape if situations changed. Option 4. Develop alternative food sources. The river below held fish. The bridge structure supported bird life. Both were potential protein sources if I could develop methods to catch them from height. Each option had problems. Each required planning, preparation, risk assessment. But I had time. 60 days might become 100 with rationing, and 100 days took me to March when weather improved and options expanded. I pulled out the journal and started documenting the realization. December 22nd. Confirmed complete societal collapse. No visible organized human activity within 15-mile radius. No rescue operations. No safe zones. No functioning infrastructure beyond automated systems. Previous survival timeline assumptions invalid. New approach required. Indefinite sustainable occupation. Then I started planning in terms of seasons rather than days. Winter, December-February focus on conservation. Extreme rationing, tower exploration, developing alternative heating if backup power fails. Spring, March-May expand operations. Attempt controlled scavenging. Develop fishing/hunting methods. Secure additional supplies while weather permits travel. Summer, June-August maximize resource gathering. Preserve foods for winter. Strengthen position security. Possibly explore reaching other bridge sections or shore if infected disperse. Fall, September-November, final preparations for winter. Stockpile everything possible. Document systems and procedures in case of injury or emergency. The seasonal plan assumed I'd survive long enough to execute it. Assumed the infected wouldn't somehow overcome the vertical barrier. Assumed I could solve the food problem and maintain the heating and avoid injury and illness and all the other threats that came with living alone 200 feet in the air. Big assumptions, but no bigger than assuming rescue was coming or society would rebuild or anything would return to what it had been. I'd stopped waiting for rescue 6 weeks ago. Now I stopped waiting for normal. This was normal. The tower, the bridge, the infected below, the seasons turning, the careful calculations of survival day by day by day. The maintenance journal had one more entry that night. The bridge saved me by accident. I'd climbed the tower for a routine inspection and became stranded above the change. But staying alive wasn't luck. It was the structure, these supplies, these systems designed for exactly the kind of extended occupation I'd been forced into. The bridge was built to support human life at height. The engineers who designed it, the workers who'd stocked the maintenance positions, the safety protocols that required emergency caches. They'd created something that could sustain a person indefinitely, even though that was never the intention. I'm a bridge maintenance worker living in a maintenance room, using maintenance supplies, performing maintenance work. Everything I'm doing is technically within job parameters. I'm just doing it permanently now, without supervision, without any expectation that the job will ever end. The bridge is holding me. I'm maintaining the bridge. The infected can't reach me here. Nobody can reach me here. This is my territory now. This is my life. I've stopped thinking about before and stopped imagining after. There's just this, the tower, the seasons, the work, the careful management of resources. I'm not waiting anymore. I'm just living. That's enough. I closed the journal, stacked my supplies, checked the door lock one final time, and lay down on the foam mat. Outside, the winter wind moved through the bridge's cables, creating harmonics that sounded almost musical. The infected wandered below in their patterns. The river flowed dark and cold beneath everything. The bridge held me, solid and permanent, a structure designed to last a century. I intended to last as long as it did. That was my plan. That was my commitment. That was the realization that changed survival from temporary desperation into permanent occupation. I slept well that night, better than I'd slept in weeks. Not because the situation had improved, but because I'd finally accepted what the situation was and stopped fighting against that acceptance. The bridge was my home. I was its custodian. We would endure together for however long endurance was possible. It was enough.